If you're like us, you've probably seen references to something called Munchausen's by proxy and been curious, without really understanding what it is or how it may affect people. That's why we were excited to hear about the new podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me.
The host, novelist Andrea Dunlop, takes an in-depth look at this subject. No one has ever done this before. She talks with people who have been affected by this condition. She even speaks with a perpetrator.
We've already listened to the first 2 episodes, and we can tell you that Andrea doesn't dwell on the darkness. She takes great pains not to be gory or exploitative. This show has heart. It focuses on the humanity of everyone involved.
And what makes this podcast extra special is that Andrea has a deeply personal connection to this subject. Someone very close to her was investigated for Munchausen by proxy. That gives the show a real emotional punch. When Andrea is listening to people tell stories about how they've been affected by this condition, she is not some uninvolved outsider. She has lived through the very same pain they have. She understands them. And through this podcast, she helps all of us understand them too.
New episodes drop every Thursday. Listen and subscribe to Nobody Should Believe Me on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder. If you haven't done so already, please go back and listen to our last 3 episodes to catch up on our look at the 2017 murders at Nadia Fish and Chicken in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago.
As a refresher, on the night before the killings at the restaurant, a man named Jerry Jacobs was gunned down in the South Shore. The next afternoon, a gunman killed 4 young men at the Nadia restaurant. Hours later, someone murdered a couple in their car in an area not far from the earlier murders. The police quickly arrested Jerry Jacobs' 19-year-old son, Maurice Harris, claiming that he had killed the 4 men at the restaurant in retaliation for the death of his father. And then they went to the media, outlining their seemingly strong case against Maurice for the murders. Overnight, it seemed as if all of Chicago was convinced of his guilt. His family and friends remained in his corner, though. And so did Ian Barney, the attorney who represented Maurice in his civil suit against the Chicago Police Department. Barney is a relatively young man, but he has more legal experience than one might expect. Here's Ian.
I don't know if people would consider me a younger attorney or not a younger attorney or what. I've been practicing for about 10 years now, but, I started working for a criminal defense lawyer back when I was 19 years old, and he's someone who is very well respected for good reason. He's, one of the best lawyers I think anyone could ever meet. And he, this was when I was in college, so I didn't know anything. And he kind of let me follow him around and let me sit on meetings and let me in on case strategy. And I learned a lot from him doing that. And he was a really, really great guy, really great mentor. And that's kind of how I got my introduction to criminal law. And then after college, I went to law school, and in law school, I worked at the state's attorney's office. And as what they call, I think, an extern, a volunteer extern. But the state's attorney is really good about getting law students really practical experience, writing motions, doing research. I actually got something called my 711 license, which is in Illinois. Under Illinois Supreme Court Rule 711, you can be certified to basically try cases in court, criminal cases in court under the supervision of another lawyer, of an older lawyer. And so at the state's attorney's office, I had the opportunity to do that. I worked in the narcotics division over there with a bunch of other really solid, really good lawyers. And then after law school, I immediately started working for another lawyer who is extremely well respected and is also a phenomenal lawyer. And, he kind of taught me a whole bunch from there. And then I started my own firm, and I continued to do criminal work, including doing a lot of appellate work, which I had done before, but not in the volume that I did after when I started my own firm. And that's a really great experience for getting into the weeds on criminal law and learning these topics kind of from top to bottom. So I'm probably, if you talk to older lawyers, they would say I'm definitely on the younger side, but I've had, I think, a unique experience in that I've been exposed to this field of law since I was, basically before I was even a sophomore in college. So I think I have a decent amount of experience.
But could an attorney, even one with Barney's expertise, hope to save Maurice from a lifetime behind bars? My name is Áine Cain.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee.
And this is The Murder Sheet, a weekly true crime podcast.
Áine and I connected over the Burger Chef murders, a 1978 unsolved case involving the killings of 4 young restaurant employees.
Now we're looking to track restaurant homicides. To help us understand the patterns of these crimes, we created a spreadsheet of nearly 1,000 eatery-related killings, the Murder Sheet. We'll be drawing on that data throughout Season 1 to give you a deep dive into undercovered crimes.
We don't just rely on skimming the headlines. We dive into these cases to bring you in-depth coverage. We're the Murder Sheet, and this is In the Shadow of Nadia, the lawyer.
Ian Barney maintains that some of the most important work a lawyer does takes place outside of the courtroom.
I'm a big believer in investigations. I work with some really great investigators, and I'm a big believer in that lawyers should take a strong hand in conducting the investigation, meaning that you should personally be involved, whether it be interviewing witnesses with your investigator or trying to chase down leads yourself, or, just working the case up and trying to plot out every avenue of investigation and running them all down, even if they're not, they're unlikely to be fruitful. I'm a big believer in that. I represent quite a few people in the post-conviction phase of criminal cases, and those oftentimes involve actual innocence claims. And, if you want to pursue or prove your own innocence, you've got to really investigate the case. And so that's something that I do on behalf of my clients. And it's, I'm a big believer that the truth is out there. You've just got to find it. You've got to find it in the right way. And sometimes it's just a matter of being dogged. And that's not to say that I was dogged or that, I'm some great investigator. Like I said, I work with investigators who are great at talking to witnesses and kind of putting them at ease and getting them to tell their story. And I just think you got to run down every lead in every case. I'm a really big believer in that.
But with experience, we often learn that things that are technically true may not work out so well in actual practice.
When I kind of came up and learned about criminal defense, the mantra was always the state has to prove your client guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And you see, if you read a lot of transcripts of cases, you see that that's oftentimes the primary defense at trial. You go to trial and the defense attorney tries to poke holes in the state's case, and their argument to the jury is, look, this guy's not credible, that lady's not credible, well, what they saw, they couldn't have seen it, they were behind a tree, or whatever the case is. This case can't be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. And I just have seen people lose cases with that argument so many times that I don't believe that that's an argument that jurors is persuasive to jurors. I don't think they understand what that means, proof beyond a reasonable doubt versus some other type of proof. So I'm a big believer that if you can, you've got to prove your innocence, even though the law doesn't say you have to prove your innocence, even though the law says the state has to prove your client guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm a big believer that you should, if you can, you should try to prove your client's innocence.
Perhaps the easiest way to convince a jury that your client is innocent is to argue that someone else committed the crime.
I was curious, in the course of your investigation, did you develop any other suspects?
Yeah, absolutely. We, and that wasn't necessarily a goal of ours. When you go into these cases, ultimately it's the state's burden to prove your client guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And, your job as an advocate for your client is to try to find ways to kind of negate that. You're not trying to prove the case that somebody else did it. You're just trying to, undercut proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, we obviously started with that premise, but we started to feel like we could prove Maurice's innocence. And as we got further down that road, we kind of came across information that we thought led to someone else potentially being involved in the murder. And I think that ended up, I don't know if it was borne out or not by subsequent evidence, but my feeling was that the person who we thought may have been involved was, that the idea that that person was involved was corroborated by stuff we learned throughout the trial or throughout the case.
Let's take a quick break from the murder sheet to tell you about a podcast investigating yet another unforgettable crime. The Orange Tree is a 7-part series about a 2005 homicide that happened near the University of Texas at Austin. The murder of 21-year-old Jennifer Cave, who was shot, dismembered, and left in a bathtub at her friend Colton Petoniak's apartment, continues to haunt the area to this day.
Like the Burger Chef murders, this case features plenty of twists and turns, including Colton's flight to Mexico with another UT student, Laura Hall. Both were later convicted in connection with the crime, although Colton has continued to appeal his verdict and claim innocence. The business student turned convicted murderer now says that he doesn't even remember much about the night Jennifer died.
The Orange Tree is reported on and produced by Haley Butler and Tanu Thomas, who were both seniors at the University of Texas when they started this project. Together, Haley and Tanu strive to piece together this tragic story in an in-depth podcast that features audio from courtroom scenes and interrogation rooms, prison phone calls, and exclusive interviews with both the perpetrators and the victim's family. You can binge all 7 episodes of The Orange Tree today on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, back to the murder sheet.
Unfortunately, Ian Barney is prohibited from revealing much information about the other person he believes may be implicated in the murders at Nadia.
So I can't really discuss that information because it's was tendered to us kind of under a protective order. So I'm really not able to get into that information. Whatever was, and I tried to not chime in too much whenever it was being discussed, just because I wanted to stay within the bounds. But whatever was kind of discussed on the record in court is really the extent of information I could share. And I think the extent of that information was that the state's attorney's office had received information from the U.S. attorney's office that suggested, however you want to put it, suggested that Maurice Harris wasn't the person that committed the crime, that perhaps it was somebody else. And that's really probably the extent I can say about it.
The information pointing to this alternate suspect at Nadia did not exist in isolation. There was corroboration.
The other kind of pieces of evidence that I thought were important to the case were DNA recovered from a vehicle that we thought was connected to the crime. And we thought it was connected based on some video footage that we saw. And there had been various pieces of, I don't even know what you'd call it, but things like hair and samples that could potentially hold DNA in them. And the police were initially not going to test these items for whatever reason, but we pushed the issue, and they did test the items, and nothing in the car came back to Maurice. But it ended up being, which was important because it showed he wasn't involved, wasn't connected to this vehicle that we thought was potentially involved in the quadruple homicide. But what ended up being very important about that was there was someone's DNA who was found in that, who was later linked to the case through information that came through the U.S. Attorney's Office down the road, which we talked about last time. And I think that's one reason why that information was even more important, even more powerful, even more exculpatory, because it wasn't uncorroborated. There was some corroboration in that the information was that, a person, I'm not going to name the person, but a person was involved in this quadruple homicide, and lo and behold, this person's DNA was found in a vehicle that may have been connected to the murders. So that was DNA was actually a really important piece of evidence, and that it excluded Maurice to some degree, and it potentially pointed towards somebody different who later got information may have actually been involved. So that was huge for the case.
I'm curious about the vehicle. What did you see on the video that suggested the vehicle was involved with the shooting?
Well, it's kind of funny because I don't mean funny in the literal sense, but I think what clued me in first was a news story about a double homicide that happened later that day that described the vehicle that was involved. And in reviewing the discovery for our case, there was CTA bus footage. So then all CTA buses, they have video cameras. And on this, I was, hours of it, watching this CTA bus footage, I saw a vehicle that matched the description of the vehicle in the news story. And I knew that the police had potentially suspected that the vehicle was involved in both the quadruple homicide and the double homicide that happened later the same day. I was kind of aware of that generally. And, and we just kind of put two and two together, and we ended up asking for all of the police files on the double homicide that happened, which I think is still unsolved to this day. But the double homicide that happened later that same day, we were able to get those, and there ended up being, in that case, actually a police chase, and the vehicle was caught on a red light camera. So they ended up getting not only a photo of the vehicle, but a photo of the license plate. And they were able to track down the license plate to a specific person, and then they were able to connect the car or the vehicle through that person to another individual. And there were several dominoes that kind of went down subsequent to that in my mind connected the car to both murders. And we had the video that suggested it was part of the quadruple homicide. So, it was really video. It was putting video evidence together. The initial kind of information from a news story, some information from what the police had mentioned about the car that they thought it was involved, both murders. So that we just were able to kind of connect some dots, and we never were able to definitively prove it was the same vehicle, but it was there was certainly some circumstantial evidence that said that it was the same vehicle in both crimes.
Next week, we'll be wrapping up the Nadia case. You'll learn what happened to Maurice Harris, and we'll share what we think his story says about the criminal justice system. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Murder Sheet. As always, thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
To keep up with the latest on The Murder Sheet, please make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Murder Sheet, and on Facebook at MSheet Podcast, or by searching Murder Sheet. If you enjoy listening to The Murder Sheet, please leave us a 5-star review to help us gain more exposure. And send tips, suggestions, and feedback to murdersheet@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.